This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. We've been talking a lot about how you organize not-for-profit organizations, and we got to the point of working with a GoFundMe, and it's been interesting to do that. We started off kind of wimpy. That's not the thing to do. You usually try to have some major contributions. We've settled on something like 100,000 because we want to buy some farmland next to the Pope Prairie in Rantoul. And that might be too much. You can change things. You don't have to have that amount. One of the opinions is that you should start with a small amount. So we might have to drop the idea of gathering up enough money to gather farmland adjacent to our prairie, which has already been planted to a Pheasants Forever prairie. But we've got underway, and that's the major thing. We have an administrative department. We have a web page, but it's administered by a friend in New York, and we don't have the GoFundMe on the website, which is what most people would go to. Many of our friends and associates don't have a big use of computers. They will do emails and text message and functional things, but links and blogs and more sophisticated things don't get seen so much. So we really need to be on the website. This means you have to have a certain amount of computer expertise, which we're lacking. I did not grow up with this sort of technology. I managed to get some of it. And many of you out there who do interesting and innovative things will have the same sort of problem. You start with one person or two or three people. Usually it's one or two people. That seems to be what the research shows. And then it gets to be a little larger and gets to be formalized and have boards and respectability, and you might even have a bed sheet of people who are known people and can speak for you. We haven't got to that stage with Heartland Pathways yet. Grand Prairie Friends has got to that stage, and they're doing very well. It usually gets a little bit more conservative as you get to be larger, because there's more people, more opinions, and you have to compromise. At the very early stages, you can probably exercise your concepts easier and then change. It was interesting that the next door neighbor has been looking at a picture of the bridge across the middle fork of the Vermilion. We have a little stand outside, and it's mostly what people sit on occasionally. But this is Saturday, and we're doing a Zoom record for broadcast on Sunday. So This is Saturday, the 11th. A sad day in many respects because of the 9/11. And that's sad, but there are people who are much more able to say something about that than we. And so tomorrow is tomorrow, and there will still be a lot of thoughts for 9/11. But let's get back to Market Street, where we have music, and it's quite friendly. People come and enjoy. The musicians come, and some of them are still learning. Some of them have equipment that doesn't always work. There has to be some tolerance amongst the audience to know what is there. But one of the reasons why we might have to drop the idea of a purchase is that we don't have that capacity yet. But we do have GoFundMe, and it's reached something like $200 already. But that's can improve. I want to show you what the prairie is like. That I have a backdrop behind me. I wonder, can I show you the backdrop? Let's see. There it is. That is the Pope Prairie behind my head. And it's, for radio people won't see this, but it's about 5 acres with extended remnant prairies around to make it about 9 acres. It's a prairie that's on a gravel pit, and it's 8 feet of gravel has been taken off there. It's glacial till, so it's rather fertile. And so even the original soil will go back into regrowth succession. It's about probably about 70 or 80 years old now, and has been regrowth successioning for a long time. You can speed up the regrowth succession by dipsy-doodling seed from the nearby railroad bed. There's a 5-acre farmland adjacent, and we would like to see this prairie that is called the Pope Prairie because the Pope family owned billboards on the road that went around this prairie. We would like to have it remain rather pristine. And we're talking about a 10-mile rail trail to Paxton, and even further than that to Loder and other places, Kankakee, east-west. Something to say about the dunes that were blown up when the world warmed and blew dunes across the country. So some of the counties to the north near Kankakee have those dunes, and I like to think of tourism and people stopping off to see these places. So a little bit of the 5 acres would be to establish a place that is rough and tough, but you could see prairie species and perhaps have a small visitor center or a kiosk. And it's near a cemetery, so if it got to the point where it didn't operate as we would anticipate, it's near a cemetery, and the cemetery might even like to extend into it. We haven't locally got any green cemeteries, but it could be that it could be a prairie cemetery with bodies buried in not much more than a shroud so that they will decompose naturally. So what we have to do is tell people about what it is we want, and that means pictorial things. So last night at the Music Live, we put pictures outside so people could see. The concentration is not on pictures or exhibits, it's on music, and that's quite okay. But there are people who note, and I heard one person say, that's interesting to see that this exhibit, we usually walk past this door and it's not open. Well, it's not open because it's the headquarters of a trail and other trails. So when we get with it, we should open the door. And that raises some questions about the nature of the front. The facade needs tuck pointing, and we might do what WIF did with their front face. They took the added piece on it and took it back to history. So we're looking to fund that sort of thing. I'm going to change my picture back so that you can see. So the Prairie is doing very well, actually. And that is one of our aims. It's an interesting challenge. And I have to repeat that last Saturday when I was talking to you, I mentioned that Doug Lynch, and I wasn't quite sure I remembered to write the name. Well, he called me again later, and he had been standing on the bridge, which is 100 feet off the ground, and quarter mile long and 998 bridge ties on it, which a number of us had put plugs in the spike holes, and he wanted to congratulate us. Well, we got talking, and that was interesting. That's the sort of thing we have to do if you're going to elaborate on what you want. You have to have blogs and comments and support to make it possible. Well, Doug was actually a Lithuanian in background, and his name is Lucha. It wasn't Lynch, it was Lutchka, and it's Lithuanian. So we here have a story, and it relates to our work with trails and prairie preservation. And Doug lived in Bucktown, which is just around the corner. And I had encountered him, and he'd taken me over. I thought it was on the motorcycle, but he thought it might be a four-wheeler. But either way, he and I were used to driving across this bridge. And other people would do that too. Bicycle people would ride across at a speed where they wouldn't have problems with bridging the bridge ties with a gap in between. But when you got them off the motorcycle and got them off to walk across the bridge, they were mortally afraid because the height was more than they had ever been used to and didn't experience with their bicycle. So Doug was standing on that bridge when he called me, and it's now a bicycle way. And the two neighbors who'd seen my photographic copy of the bridge had decided that they wanted to visit the bridge, and they did. And I've since talked to them, and they had a little trouble finding it in the first place, went too far, but came back and were very glad to stand on a bridge where you actually look at the top of a tree. and you look down on the river, and you have to know that that river has to have pylons, and sometimes the pylons get wood piled up on there and trees, and so you have to be careful about that because it can affect the stability of your bridge. So sometimes you have to do things like put a stick of dynamite in the collection of trees and get rid of them so that they don't accumulate and destroy the bridge. Well, Doug had been around, and so I asked him, how did he get to Danville? Well, his father was a Lithuanian, and I'm Australian in background, and I've known Lithuanians and Estonians and Latvians that have had political problems because they're almost a part of Russia, and many of them have had differences of opinion, and it's not exactly healthy for them to be in that country. So the artists and people that I know have been migrants to Australia by dint of the fact that they couldn't still remain in their own country. It's interesting that I grew up with cane cutting. Cane, we were on a river. We had a place called Grafton, and I'm going to talk to you about Grafton later. But right now, I remember Australians inviting Europeans to come to Australia on a very low budget. They might have paid $10 or something like that, but they had to do 2 years of public service. And one of the public services that they did was to cut cane. And so you would have European people, some of them were doctors and people who had skills that weren't necessarily the ones that they were adjudicated to operate with. So they were a part of the cane group too, and very educated people. We enjoyed their company, and they cut the cane and it went onto little railroads that took the cane out to barges, and the barges took the cane down the river to McLean, where there was a mill to produce sugar. Not at that time, not necessarily known to be somewhat of a overdose of sugar is not actually good to your health, but sugar and salt can both act as osmosis and can keep things like butter alive on a trip from Australia to England, and which was regarded as Australia's colonial ancestor. So the migrants were contributing to that mill, and the use of sugar and salt to preserve things. So you could also do things like drying and use sulfur to dry fruit, for instance. Well, back to Lithuania again. Father had come to the US, probably escaping some of the political strife that sent people to other countries. And America was an attraction. I didn't ask Doug if he had come through England or France or other places on the way, but he got to Pennsylvania and got to be mining. He probably was mining in Europe, but had some background that allowed him to do that. And then there was a call for miners in the West. The Louisiana Purchase had been invoked, and there was coal in places like Danville. So Doug's father came to Danville, along with a whole bunch of other different ethnic groups. And so Danville has a background in ethnic groups. At that stage, the mining was deep mining, and you had a slanting runway that went down into the coal seam that was pulled by pit ponies, small wagons, and then that was transferred to a coal train that would have been parked very near. And actually, the bridge we're talking about was part of that railroad line, and it was one of the ways of getting the coal to other communities, or actually taking it to an Illinois power production plant or electrical production plant nearby. So father was in the era when you had pit ponies, and you often had a 5-acre lot where you grew hay for the pit ponies. The pit ponies didn't come out into the open very much. They were actually often went blind because of that. They didn't actually need their eyesight as much as they were used for beasts of burden. Then came the strip mining, where you plowed the overburden away, exposed the coal seam, and then you could have huge clamshell cranes that would pick up that coal and put it into small trains, or actual trains that would take it out to other places. Some of those clamshells were big enough that you could drive a truck into them. That size. The trucks would drive down into the coal seam so they could be loaded, and they would have standing roads come out. So we got talking, and it was fun to reminisce, because I had talked last week about the coal mines that made dams. You could get to a coal mine by digging a big dam, and then once it was finished, it gradually filled with water and became a lake. So there are a number of lakes, and we were talking about biology of it. So my interest in Danville was somewhat associated with Dr. Kendi and people who were doing research on those mines, because an early mine, one that was older, would have biodiversity, and younger mines would have, or ponds would have much less biodiversity, but much more of one or two species. So we got to thinking about who came to Danville and what happened when the strip mining went in and the deep mining fell obsolete. Well, you have little 5-acre patches that people would generate hay on, and they became sales places for secondhand cars and things like that. So you can recognize that sort of sociology in Danville. But also GMC came to Danville, and they needed employees. So that was an alternative for people who are out of work because deep mining had been obsoleted. Just talking to each other, we started to reminisce about standing at Mission Field and looking over these rows and rows of strip mine areas, and how the leftover pond could be quite deep. And I would work with Dr. Kendi and others to look at that, what was growing in the deep ponds or in the shallow ponds or deeper ponds that were left. So interesting place. Mission Field is where we talked a little bit about gob piles. So gob piles were where the overburden was brought out on a deep mine, and they disappeared because they were acid and fairly prone to investigation by groups like environmental protection agents. We knew where the Price, I think, the family was, the Peace family, because the river meanders around by Bucktown, and before the Salt Fork of the Vermilion joins the Middle Fork, and later joins the North Fork. And we talked about this. At this point, the road, which is normally north, south, east, and west Jeffersonian Platte, was encountering a river. So you have Wiggle Woggle Road, and you could look over into the pond that was on the other side. And there were meanders that were native, that hadn't been strip mined, but had been caused by the river meandering around, and a narrow neck that could be cut off. But those sorts of places have been retreats for the like of Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and so Vermilion County has a native as well as a human terrain, and we knew different places where you go north, and there's ponds that have been established there, and there was a movement because the Department of Natural Resources was buying up land that could be part of an overall Kickapoo State Park. And not everyone was excited about that because they lost their farmland. And there's still lots of argument about it because the bicycle people have found canyons that are nice to go around and be challenged by. So that is an ongoing theme. And the old power plant, it's a leachate. The leftover material that has been burned to create this steam, which runs the motors and creates the electricity, that has been leaching into the river that comes from the north, the Middle Fork. So there's been a lot of action about that. We talked about that a little bit. We talked about coming by Muncie and across Stony Creek. There's several Stony Creeks. And there are little roads that go around the back there into Jordan Creek. And so you can wander around the area of the strip mining and also the non-strip mining areas. There are quite a few people, including people from the Natural History Survey, who have second houses, weekenders over there and plots around, and sometimes it's because they're looking at the organisms that are round about. And there was a conky town, and the conky town, so Doug and I were talking about this. It used to have a long race. We had one of these narrow necks, and you could have a long race, and there was a mill there, and the mill foundations are still there. And the stream runs clear because there's underlying limestone. This was an uplift of sedimentary rocks, but one of the rocks was limestone, were created by calcareous organisms that are compressed into limestone, and you get out of your canoe there, and excitingly, you just step into something that's hard underneath, whereas in other places where you step out of the canoe, you're stepping into mud, part of the glacial tilt. So Doug continues to be interested and intrigued by the biology of Vermilion County, and so do people like the Audubon. There's been a rather famous local picture of a heron with a fish in its mouth, and that's in a dam that's north of Danville. And some of this spreads into Indiana, and so the railroad that was part of the bridge that we're talking about used to run into Lafayette, Indiana, and then it's active into Indianapolis. These railroad beds are being saved by bicycle and hike organizations that work with the federal government to have one more public use of the railroad bed, the right-of-way, and to save the right-of-way for possible future use. We don't know what will happen, whether we've gone through a whole sequence of transportation, going from canoes to boats that had keels to boats that had wheels, water wheels on the back, water wheels on the side, to railroads that followed the populations that came to and settled on the rivers. So we've gone through those machinations. So there's no guarantee that we will need rights of way, but it's very handy to have them, and they communicate and they connect, and they not only for people, but they're also for creatures, butterflies and birds and bees. I went to a Sierra Club meeting, and a lot of the discussion was about monarchs and people growing monarchs and counting the monarchs in their backyard. Some people had 12 monarchs so far, and they find caterpillars that are eating on milkweeds, and then they have chrysalises, amazing chrysalises, and then they opt out. They dry up and then fly away. And so one comment was that, well, there are other butterflies too, but this one is famous. It goes to Mexico, and you could have thousands and thousands of orange butterflies on some of the trees, to the point that the tree looks orange rather than green, and the wings make such an amount of noise that you can hear the sound. So it doesn't hurt to play on monarchs, because the other butterflies will also enjoy. They have a very short lifespan, where you're going to find some of these creatures die naturally, but people get to know about them. And then for me, if they know about them, then we need 5 acres of land somewhere to add to a conservation area, to add to a bicycle way. So there are interconnections here, and the next door neighbors who went over and found the bridge and stood on the bridge and looked at those trees, at the top of the trees, and enjoyed that. We need these alternatives, and that's what our Go fundraiser is about. And even though it's starting slowly, we hope that it will generate enough money to buy 5 acres adjacent to the existing Pope Prairie. I was interested to know people that I meet at the North American Prairie Conference, and one of those people is Dicey Madsen. Dicey Madsen's husband was John Madsen, and John Madsen is rather a famous person for prairie preservation. He has authored books. He's grown up on the Mississippi River, and he has 3 books that I know of. The Sky Began, Where the Sky Began, is a standard text for prairie people, and Up the River, and Stories from Under the Sky. Well, John Madsen spent his time on the river. He wanted to say that he didn't exactly enjoy people coming from affluent east and discovering the Mississippi and wanting to flow down it. And his comment was, you could flow down it very quickly and not really see it. He is much more interested in the pieces that make it a rather wonderful experience, including humans as well as animals, as well as the extended headwaters. And so John was on the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. I thought it was a very good selection, and he was there for quite a while. And I think of that because on Tuesday, the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission will be meeting. It will be a different committee. Since then, John has died and left Dicey, and she would come to North American Prairie meetings and sell his books. And she was the illustrator. She was the artist that's illustrated these books. And so some of my books that relate to John are signed by Dicey as the artists. I have a daughter, and sometimes the daughter would come to sort out her mother's sale booth. So I would sell silkscreen prints at the North American Prairie Conference, and often had a booth near to Dicey. So I figure I sort of know the family. The family eventually moved from Iowa to Grafton, and I happen to have roots in Grafton, Australia, and I think there's Graftons in other places like South Africa. Graftons must have had a place in England, probably England, that was on a river. Most early settlement was on rivers. It's kind of sad that these days, as the water levels are rising, those original cities like New York and London, for instance, are in jeopardy because they may get flooded out. uh, uh, not necessarily totally, but occasionally. Uh, Grafton in Australia is on the Clarence River, and that is where the European settlers would come and work out their 2 years of public service by cutting cane, and it would float down the river just a little bit, like the same way with the Mississippi. So going back to John and that whole corridor, he gives a good summary of its history. They were Indians, and they used this territory. They were having some battles with themselves because the white settlers were moving into the east and forcing Chippewa, especially Indians, further west. And that was difficult because there ended up being a little battles over the general territory. But then white settlers began to move in. Before that, there were the adventurous people who would explore the headwaters of the Mississippi, for instance. And the Indians would act as guides, but they were always very curious as to why the public was so interested in the headwaters of a river and the naming of the headwaters, applauding giving accolades to finding the headwaters. But rivers don't start like that. They start with the rainfall dropping on the spot. And if it's 10 inches of water, then that will be the creek that's the headwaters at the time. And if it's a drought, it'll be some other place that's the headwaters. That it's like you drain an area with a palmate drainage. That means you put your hand out on every finger and some creeks that come in to a catchment area. It might be a lake, and then wander on, and it might include waterfalls. And it's always been intriguing to first settlers as to where the starting point of the Mississippi is, and they'd have a designation. It's and there's a signpost, and tourists come and take photographs of the headwaters of the Mississippi. But the natives kind of think that this is fun because that may be the headwaters at the moment, but basically the headwaters are abraded streams. So then you have Indians, and you have the use of the water. They were very good at making canoes. They would use paperbark birch and use fat and other materials to make it watertight, and it was maneuverable. You could go hunting with it. It was very silent. So some of the earlier explorations, even with the Caucasian populations, were by canoe. And then it got to be bigger canoes with some lumber and some capacity to carry loads. And so there were a variety of canoes. And settlement started to come further. It came down from the north or up from the south. The south tend to be Cajuns, and coming in from Canada, where they were, the French Canadians were not appreciated, but some of them came to places like Kankakee. There's a Cajun settlement at St. Andrews, and it's near Kankakee, and it has all the elements of a Cajun background. So those people gradually explored the river from north and south, and some of them were coming from the east via the Ohio River. Same difficulties, canoes, and they would come down to Cairo and then go up the Mississippi. Mississippi was a name that was contorted from native language, that it kind of stuck. But most of the Mississippi is not on the Mississippi, it's on the Missouri. Because when you get to St. Louis and you go west, this complex of water from the overall Midwest basin is coming from parts of the Snowy Mountains, the rough, the mountains that are in Denver or even further west. And so there are the headwaters there too. John Madsen is quick to point out that the larger part of the Mississippi catchment basin is the Missouri. And he divides the Missouri up into parts. There is the lower Mississippi, which he doesn't find quite so interesting because it gets to be commercial fairly soon. And then there's the middle, which runs up through Peoria and to probably Rock Island. And then there's the northern extension. And it's that section that he's most interested in. And he communicates with the river rats. The river rats are people who grow up on the river. They make their own boats. They hunt their own animals, and probably not known to the general public other than in the bars that they visit. And so there was, after canoes, there was a keelboat, and those keelboats were much more able to take a load. They could take 14 people, often working. They would have a little walkway around so that you could put, if you were in areas where there was swampland, you could put down a pole and push. So if you had 6 people on one side and 6 people on the other side, this is like rowing a racing canoe. You all put it at the same time. You may do it by song, but you move the boat through the shallows or swamplands, and then you all walk back, and you do the same again. And you can take a fair bit of weight and get places. You could move up the river as distinct from down the river. You could also take advantage of the currents, and it got to be a commercial river. One of the things that was wonderful was if you were in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or a place like that, there were pine trees, and these could have 7 and 8 inch diameter, huge trees where you could make beams, and you could actually put these trees together. And if you had clever people who were able to do so, you could float these trees down the tributaries to the main river, and then you could make assessments of these or accumulations of these. So you had a pontoon, and you could put a vehicle behind them, a towboat that it would pull, it would push. and it would float downstream. And those could be raw trees, or they could be partially sawn. But they provided most of the trees for most of the railroad beds and the buildings that were being put up. In fact, the bridge ties that I was putting plugs into in Danville were not local timbers. They were probably white pine or yellow pine from the north. Biggies, 10 inch by 10 inches. There were no miserable railroad ties. These were bridge ties. So there was that utilization, and it was rough and tough. The railroads, first of all, there were canals, and they hardly got into action before there were railroads. And the settlement had been by the water. And so your area, places like that, Rock Island, Quad Cities, and St. Louis, all on the water. And so the commerce was that narrow strip. So gradually you start to lose some of the quality of the land around. The railroads were given land to take down the trees, and that was their payment for putting in the railroad. But that sort of got raunchy. People would move into other people's property. And I know that even in the 60s, I encountered someone who had bought forested land in the Rocky Mountains. And when they visited later, all the trees were gone. And that was not an uncommon thing. So people were feathering their own nests. And then came the fishing. And it was very easy to take out the fishes. And then came mussels. And mussels were harvested by the thousands, and eventually that reduced the population. Part of the advantage was to have the shells for buttons and other things where we didn't have plastic at those times. There was also a drive to look for pearls that would be in the mussels. So, and then there would be shallows where by this time you had side wheeler and back paddle ships, shallow draft, could go upstream. They could even go through some of the swamps. But you had to have very clever captains who would do this. If they lost a rudder, they were lucky if they had side paddles, because like a bulldozer today, you could put a brake on one and let the other one roll. So you could turn a vehicle around. So you could actually move a paddle wheeler in that manner. Gradually, the railroads took over. Then later, the roads took over and followed the railroads off. So, Matson's history here means that he goes out and goes to the taverns, goes to the person who is harvesting the mussels by hand, by taking a pole with a bunch of chains on it, because when the mussel is feeding, it's wide open. And if something drops into it like a chain, it closes, and then you could pull it up, and then you could boil it and expose the mussel. The dogs eat the mussel. it was a question of, do people eat that? And the Indians, the native, would eat that meat, but the Caucasians didn't do that. It was a waste. But these little interactions of people being out on the river, working from 4 o'clock in the morning to late at night, and often known as river rats. And they're there today. They keep a living. They may not be known except to the local tavern where they are known, and there's a history, an oral history there. And some of these communities were gaming houses, boarding houses. The early history is given quite a hearing by John Madsen and Dicey, his wife, who comes to illustrations. I think he died rather sooner than expected. So Dicey was hoping to travel, and they were going to do that together from their Grafton base. Grafton is right where the Illinois River comes in and joins the Mississippi. There are stories about the tributaries. I think it's time. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And think about WEFT. It allows us to do this, and about a public television that helps us, provides the camera and the microphone for me to do a Zoom. And we just like to support those small artsy-fartsy organizations that contribute massively to community action. So thank you.